Dr. James, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. I've read more than a dozen books about America's founding period and the antebellum era. So I got super excited for our interview and I started jotting down questions about America's relationship with Canada, colonial Canada, that is. But then I realized you and I could spend hours and hours just talking about that. Instead of approaching it that way, let's do this, Dr. James. Why don't you please start the conversation by telling us this? Are there any major events or developments in the US colonial Canada relations with long enduring impacts?
Thank you, Adele, for having me on your podcast. And the answer, the short one, is yes. And I'll just go
Yes.
to a few points that are cumulative. To jump ahead a bit, these things come together to account for an element of xenophobic anti-American nationalism that I know we're going to talk about later. I'm sure we'll get to it. So if you go
Wow.
all the way back to the 7 Years' War in the late 18th century, you have animosity between the British and the French. And part of
Dr.
the
James, and the
conflict.
7 Years' War is before our Revolutionary War.
Oh yes, it is before 1776. It's in the
Okay.
18th century,
Mhm.
and it's a key precursor. For instance, George Washington fought in that war on the side of the British,
Yeah, yeah.
which is easy to forget. And it was, of course, the United States was still a colony. In this deep background, there is conflict that involves the French on one side and the British on the other. There is a history of conflict back and forth across what we now recognize the Canadian border. That's a deep context, and it will come into play later on if we talk about Quebec and certain other issues. By the time you get into the point of the origin of the United States, 1776, the American Revolution, there are tensions throughout the 19th century involving Britain and the United States and Canada, what will become Canada by proxy. So, for example, as we get closer to Confederation in 1867, when Canada comes into being, there are a couple of things to talk about. One is fear and tensions over what were called the Fenian raids. The Fenians were Irish nationalists who were based out of New England and who would raid Canada, especially the Eastern
Oh,
Corridor. And this caused a long-term sort of angst. The Fenians were never a serious threat, but just because something isn't real doesn't mean it's perceived. It isn't perceived. And then, and there's some mythology about this, but here's the basic core truth. Canadian Confederation in 1867 is a way of integrating, at the time, pretty disparate British governed provinces into something that might look like more of a deterrent to US expansionism. And of course, the US expansionism through the Louisiana Purchase and the Mexican War and on and on and on, that's out there too. So there's an identity of manifest destiny. This will be familiar to many American
yeah, yeah.
uh, viewers, of course. What if that involves gobbling up Canada? In fact, in 1866, I think that's the right year, there was even a bill in Congress about annexing Canada. And of course, quite famously, in 1867, what became known at the time as Seward's Folly was the purchase of Alaska from Russia. So the
Yeah.
United States now, the price when one looks at it now is completely absurd. And it's what a bargain. They called it Seward's Folly, and that the cabinet minister Seward, who organized and led the push for the purchase of Alaska, was ridiculed. It was called his folly. But now pretend you're in London in the 1860s. The Americans have come out of the Civil War with what is arguably, after 1865, the most advanced and powerful army in the world. And here are your skittish colonies, thousands of miles across the Atlantic in what we now call Canada. They realistically were not capable of defending themselves. But from an American standpoint, the Canadian Confederation could give pause and say, well, should we really try to take this over? And of course, one other key factor as to why nothing like that happened. there was incredible war fatigue after 1865. That massive army led by General Grant that I referred to, by the Grant administration a few years later when he becomes president, it's no more. The United States is back to having a much more modest
Yeah.
military. One other thing, again, sort of British US tensions playing into things, especially during the Civil War in the 1860s, there were huge conflicts about the United States blockading the Confederacy, the Union as it was known during the Civil War. And there was a lot of fighting and quarreling with Great Britain. There could have been other wars. We won't go into great detail here. But if we went into it chapter and verse, until you get into the 20th century, there was a reasonable possibility that the United States and Great Britain could have gone to war with each other again, not just the revolution that everybody knows about starting off in 1776, but a lot of other things too could have led in that direction.
Wow, there was so much there, Dr. James. With respect to your last sentence, could have gone to war again. For our audience, U.S. and colonial Canada actually did go to war twice. One was during our own Revolutionary War. I think at some point Benedict Arnold may have been involved with that. I don't. Yeah, you're shaking your head, and
And in
yeah,
fact, the War of 1812,
exactly. Yeah.
which is a weird, almost bizarre precursor to Vietnam. I mean that in the sense, not that there
Wow.
were gigantic casualties, but it was a war that people didn't want. It's still a head scratching kind of thing when the United States declares war against Great Britain in 1812. The U.S. public, as it existed at the time, was not enthusiastic. There was a much more powerful British Navy at the
Hmm.
time. The U.S. Navy couldn't compete. So this, I think, when we look back onto it, a head scratching type of thing, as in, did this really work out well for anyone? The reason it doesn't compare perfectly to Vietnam is the casualties, even for the times, and I don't mean to make light of them, were relatively light.
Relatively
And
light. Wow.
the United States just didn't fight to win. It was like a holding action, and the war was settled. And then the border was largely settled between the two countries at that time. Still the longest for viewers,
Yeah.
longest essentially demilitarized border in the world.
Um, I myself had a revelation, as I was reading about the history of the United States, and one of my readings several years ago, how Northeast U.S. then didn't want the 1812 war. In fact, they very vociferously advocated against it. Um, as you were talking about Canada's Canada's sort of position, the position that it assumed against the United States expansionism, or what they perceived to be expansionism. Well, it's not perception, it was actual reality. I'm wondering this. Tell me if I'm going too far, Dr. James. It was part of Canada's identity then formed as an opposition to America? Does my
The
question go ahead? Does
oh,
my
oh no,
question make sense?
it makes sense, and it's arguably it all leads to the single most important point in understanding the relationship. The short answer is yes, and there is a tradition among Canadians of what you would call xenophobic or negative nationalism. Is, hey, I'm not some American. You'll get that among
We'll
Canadians.
talk about
Uh,
that.
in a brilliant book published years ago, and it's what I'm about to say is absolutely true. The late and great scholar Martin Lipset said when he looked at the two countries and how the people perceived themselves and each other, he said quite wisely, Americans understate the differences between the two, and Canadians overstate them. Uh, Justin Trudeau's father, as a quick
That's
follow up, who was
beautiful.
prime minister, yes, it is. It is. It sums things up beautifully. And in my personal experience, I'm binational. I'm a Canadian by origin, but I've lived in the U.S. a long time. When I go back to visit, or when I'm in the U.S., that Lipset's thesis, if you will, on perceptions of difference and similarity are absolutely borne out. And the late Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, was prime minister a long time ago, back in the late 60s through the early 80s. He said, I'm muddling the quote a little bit, it doesn't really matter because you can get the essence. He said, you know, being Canadians next to the Americans, it's almost like we're a mouse sleeping next to an elephant. He may have said something other than a mouse, another small creature.
Wow.
We are
Wow.
affected by every twitch and grunt that comes from the elephant. And that's a more colorful way of putting it, but I think it's still largely true that, and I mean no disrespect when I say this, the average American shows less interest in Canada than vice versa. And that is because the United States, with 200 countries in the world and so many things going on, Americans have a lot more on their mind as the essential self-perceived and designated leader of the free world. Canadians do not have that type of identity at all, have never aspired to it. It's a small, rich country with good skiing, just like Switzerland, but it's in a very different place.
Yeah, yeah. Dr. James, I had queued up this question to ask you, but I now think it's sort of moot. I was going to ask whether or not uh, Canada's relationship or perception of America suddenly changes if you flip a switch in 1867 when it proclaimed itself as a confederation. And I think the answer is no. I sort of how they felt about America actually continued, and they may have actually formed their confederation just based on what you said because of their relationship with the U.S.
That's absolutely true. It's more of an incremental thing, a sense of differentiation that crystallizes into what I just
Hmm.
described.
Interesting.
Importantly, at every stage, the sort of more of an identification of an English identity and culture. Recall, of course, that the United States is revolutionary. It breaks violently away from Anglo domination, whereas Canada, it's a gradual pulling away as
Yeah, yeah,
opposed
yeah.
to a direct rupture. Importantly, the key identity difference, this gets a bit into the weeds of political science, is individualism versus collectivism. And I explain this to
Oh,
people who don't know anything about Canada by looking at two different mottos. The American one is very familiar: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Sounds pretty individualistic, doesn't it?
mhm.
Canada is peace, order, and good governance. Good
Oh,
government, excuse me. POG, peace,
peace,
order, and good government. Peace,
peace.
order, good government. And notice the difference. One is about being stable and being part of a group that doesn't rock the boat, whereas the American one is in your face: life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. I will do what I want to get what I want. And I'm not saying the
Wow.
United States is libertine. Canadians, then, importantly, notice the word government was in that motto.
Yeah, yeah.
They're more comfortable, and this has been witnessed many, many times. They're much more comfortable with government activity, regulation. The sheer size of government in Canada is rarely an issue. Even the more right of center conservative party doesn't talk about it nearly as much as, say, a prominent Republican from history like Ronald Reagan, or the current soon to
Yeah.
be, excuse me, soon to be occupant of the White House, Donald Trump. It's just not as much of a thing as in the average Canadian. Again, average is more comfortable with government than the average American.
Wow, that is fascinating. Um, let's take a break here. We'll be back after a short break to talk about America's, as Dr. James mentioned, long border with Canada, ergo, our intertwined economies. We'll also talk about this Canadian anti-Americanism. And I'll ask Dr. James, does America really protect Canada? We'll be back. Dr. James, in the last segment, you said something about xenophobia on the Canadian side, where Canadians say, I'm not American. I'm probably butchering what you said, but something to this effect.
That's about right.
So I've come across this phrase more than once. Quote, Canadian anti-Americanism, end quote. Is this a real thing?
It's absolutely a real thing, and it exists within limits. So, for instance, when you look at what Canadians complain about or talk about, here's how they try to put a positive spin on it. I'll use anecdata. So a key element of Canadian identity is the nationalized healthcare system. And a
Oh, yeah, yeah.
politician, probably none of your American audience will ever have heard of who Tommy Douglas was. When Canadians voted on the greatest, there was an open vote on the greatest Canadian of the 20th century. This obscure socialist politician from Canada's Socialist Party, which is called the NDP, the New Democratic Party, Tommy Douglas shepherded this through Parliament, even though importantly, he never became prime minister. He wasn't what in the sort of American individualist parlance would call a big winner. But look who wins the vote among Canadians. Where am I going with this? After I'd left
Yeah.
Canada for a long time, I was in Florida at a conference, and my Canadian accent had faded. You couldn't tell what I was. A Canadian sat down with me, and we'd just been at a public policy panel, we being two professors. Uh, she could see my badge, which showed my American affiliation. And the subject of Canada came up, and she pointed her finger at me and she said, you know, unlike you, we Canadians have a national healthcare system to take care of people properly. That's a near, now that was great data for me because I was kind of get a
Oh
sense. I didn't
boy.
even tell her what I was, that I was born and raised in Southern Ontario, Canada's largest province. I didn't say anything for a while. And then it became obvious I knew a little too much, and she felt somewhat embarrassed about the incident. But that's right there. It's, I would frankly call it a knee jerk reaction. Importantly, it is more elite centered. The more left of center and the more elite you are, and by elite, I mean what is often called the chattering classes, you know, journalists, people who are on TV, intelligentsia, professors. That's where you get the really strong variant of what I just described.
Is that is that anti-Americanism? Let me ask it this way. Is that anti-Americanism a disdain or dislike for America, or is it, do you think, envy?
To be candid, it is really more a product of envy. Imagine I'm just trying to think of an example
Yeah.
that even works here really well. It's a hard thing to explain. So let's take the Beatles for a moment.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And if I was some obscure musician and was not comparable in any way and never would be the Beatles, I could say something like this. Well, you know, I'm playing this club next week and I looked it up. The Beatles never played there. No, you've got something. You've got a place to hang your hat. So you're not inferior across the board in terms of, and again, as a person born in Canada, and I love Canada, um, I find this more humorous than anything else, except when it causes problems. And at some point, Adele, I imagine we'll get to foreign policy and national security. There's an asterisk. Most of the time, Canadian badgering, if you will, of Americans saying, why don't you have national health care? Don't you care about people? Things like that, as in,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
we're a kinder and gentler society. They're finding something to feel good about compared to the ridiculously overwhelming power and importance of the United States
Yeah,
by
yeah.
comparison. Remember Trudeau and the mouse? Canada's probably more like a muskox, as I said in one of my books. It's
Muskox.
a pretty important country, but boy, if you're stuck next to the Americans, I don't know how many are football fans out there, but even if you're a pretty good quarterback and Patrick Mahomes shows up, you're just shaking your head and bowing it down. Is that I
Yeah,
can't beat this guy. He's too much. So there
exactly.
is, I think it's envy. I think you're absolutely right. At times it becomes toxic. Most of the time, I think it's just funny. And I think it's probably good for maintaining a positive self image to find a place to hang your hat. As in,
Yeah,
we
yeah.
are a more, I mean this in a gentle way, not a nasty one. Canada is more collectivist and socialist. As one example, there's never been a really high powered socialist party that gets any seats in Congress in the United States. But Canada's NDP is one of multiple socialist parties that have
Yeah.
existed. And the Green Party is arguably even more to the left than the NDP. And it has a presence in Canada that's significant too.
Yeah. Um, Beatles was a great example. And my takeaway from that is that next time I'll go to a club, I'll have to ask whether or not Beatles have been there, Dr. James. Um, So, as you stated, US and Canada share the longest border. So, do we now have significant border issues with Canada?
We have H2O related border issues. So the
Water,
water, it's going to be about water
water.
and waterways in particular. The Rush-Bagot Convention of 1815, after that War of 1812,
Mhm.
didn't settle all of the land border disputes.
Mm,
Circling back just for a moment, the 1903 Alaska border dispute is it was settled, but it is seen by Canadians who take their basic history classes as those dastardly Americans winning a battle against the United States because the British commissioner on the commission of 1903 sided with the Americans. And there's another longer story as to why that happened. But it's one of those slights, as in, well, our British friends sold us out because Canada didn't have complete and full sovereignty in its foreign policy in 1903, even
I
though it had
see.
become a
Yeah.
country in 1867. So the land disputes that we could talk about are small, and I think generally not very interesting. There's almost nothing to talk about there. But wow, now we get into climate change and the Beaufort Sea, north of Alaska and northern Canada, the Yukon,
Mhm.
being one of Canada's territories in the very far north, up above the Arctic Circle. With climate change, there's great interest in a Northwest Passage that could be a fantastic boon to commerce. And okay, who's going to control that waterway? Importantly, historically, it's largely been iced in or too risky to rely on because what if you suddenly get ice that
Yeah.
blocks you?
Yeah.
So it's not a year-round type of opening. Depending, and this is very hard to foresee, but realistically, it's coming at some random point. There is going to be a Northwest Passage. And if you put up a map at some point about this, you'll see there are multiple pathways. This is what the fight is about. Canada wants to restrict these waterways in the jargon or terminology for this is an exclusive economic zone or EEZ. The United States says, no way. These waterways are broad enough and far enough from Canadian shorelines that you shouldn't be allowed to say who goes through them. They ought to be international. And that is going to be, there's a pun here that a lot of people use, as in the Arctic is heating up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Linked to that point is a bigger and broader security issue. The United States also fears Canadian irresponsibility, that if something is
Irresponsibility? Huh.
irresponsibility, and this we get into again, we're kind of foreshadowing security related issues.
Wow.
Let's just say the Canadians, okay, Canadians, you're right. Canada controls these waterways. The United States promises not to interfere with them. Will the Russians respect that?
And
You
Russians have
tell
a
me.
lot of forts. They're built military bases, naval bases. They have many, many more ice cutters than America does.
Even America, and guess what Canada has as Arctic military capacity? Nothing. This has been allowed to atrophy, like a pair of like a set of golf clubs that have been sitting outside for years and have rusted. I wouldn't recommend trying to use them. The Canadian capacity to protect its sovereignty in the Arctic, I would say if you rated it from 0 to 100, I would say it's 0 in terms of individual capacity.
Wow.
Anything and everything will depend on the United States. And here's a technical point that's incredibly important, and this concerns what is known as military procurement. I can't, even if I'm a well intentioned Canadian prime minister, snap my fingers and say, that's it. We need warships and we need icebreakers, and I want them by next week. Ha ha, funny. It takes years and years to produce these
Wow.
types of incredibly expensive items. They're very specialized and they take years. You would have needed to be doing something a long time ago to be ready for potential Russian and, by the way, also Chinese threats.
Yeah. Yeah.
The Chinese are also developing Arctic technology, if you will, broadly stated. They want to be an Arctic actor. They've even made statements, as in we, the Chinese, I may not be translating it perfectly, of course, regard ourselves as an Arctic actor. So we will be active in the Arctic.
Never
They're
mind that.
interested in the Northwest Passage too.
Never mind that they have no border. They're not within proximity of the Arctic area. Um, I was watching Mr. Trump's Mar-a-Lago news conference last week. I think it might have been Monday or Tuesday. I don't recall. He talked about a range of stuff: Greenland, Gulf of America versus Gulf of Mexico, and he also, I think, mentioned this. He made this statement. It was either then or another day that we protect Canada. Is that true? Does America protect Canada?
Absolutely and utterly true. It was less true after World War II. So, really short historical background. By some measures, after 1945, largely because of the destruction of other great powers' capacities, Canada had the third most powerful navy in the world. Think about that.
Wow.
Behind, of course, the Americans, the Soviets, the British had suffered such enormous losses, of course. So let's say, okay, Canada was only fifth. Well, what is Canada now? I wouldn't even begin to think of what its numerical ranking would be. It's basically zero. And I want to take a pause that I
Mm-hmm.
mean no disrespect to people who serve in the Canadian forces. This is not their fault that they don't have proper equipment or ships. They just haven't been funded. And so, does the United States protect Canada? There's a Canadian angle on this I want to pass along. It's called defense against help. And what do I mean by that?
Repeat that again.
Scholars
Defense against help.
Defense against help. Defense against help was a concept developed by the great Canadian foreign policy specialist Niels Orvik a really long time ago. Niels Orvik articulated something people sort of already understood, as in, here's the rule for Canadian military force. We need to be strong enough to deter the Americans from meddling with our sovereignty. So, for example, in terms of Canadian
Oh,
identity and xenophobic nationalism, what would Canadians think about American military bases speckled all over Canada? How about American warships patrolling Hudson Bay? Oh my goodness. No, no, no. We don't like that. But here's the problem: successive Canadian governments, starting with Trudeau the Elder in the 1960s, essentially dismantled Canadian military capacity. And importantly, since we're talking about the Arctic here, really zero capacity navy wise to do anything about incursions from hostile powers. And in fact, even from friendly ones. If Norway decided it wanted to plant a flag on Baffin Island, what would Canada do about that? I would say probably ask the Americans for help. That's how I've circled back to the main point. This is
wow.
where the new Canadian Prime Minister, Poilievre, who's about to come in, he'll come in at some random point when the Trudeau government falls. The Canadian Liberal government will be led by someone else, X, who is the new leader who will replace Trudeau. It's very likely Canadian Parliament dissolves, and one of the big election issues, I predict, will be how much are Canadians who traditionally don't like defense spending willing to shell out to deter Donald Trump in particular from becoming more aggressive about U.S. military deployments in the Arctic, as in, if you're not going to defend yourselves, I have to protect you. There's another important entity here called NORAD, the North American
Yeah.
Radar Defense System. The acronym actually is a little different than that. Importantly, this is supposed to be shared as a responsibility by Canada and the United States. You'd need someone more specialized on NORAD than me to do the details, but I can say unequivocally the United States is fed up with basically Canada's lack of funding to NATO, and NORAD as an adjunct to that Canada just doesn't pull its weight. Now we come back to the concept of defense against help. The reason Trump is right, as in we protect Canada, is that Canada isn't even acting like a muskox next to the elephant. It's acting pretty mousy. Now, here's the simple follow up. Well, why on earth would they do that? It's reckless, and it's because Canadians, like certain other NATO members, have become addicted to spending things on items other than military security. So, why would we want to buy a tank or some icebreaker when we can have
Wow.
more programs that benefit our people on a day to day basis and help to reelect the government?
This is so interesting. I'll quickly just impress you, Dr. James. When my family and I were, we've been to Canada several times on vacation. I think I told you that before. our program. And then in one in particular, we timed it to go and see the Calgary Stampede. For Americans who haven't gone, you really should. The day after we visited, Prime Minister Trudeau came and visited the Calgary Stampede. The reason I bring this up, because you mentioned tanks, and part of the grounds on which the Stampede, Calgary Stampedes, for Americans, just think of 50 rodeos put together. This is larger than that. It's a humongous production. Part of it was reserved for displaying Canada's military. There were many tanks. There were Canadian version of Coast Guard. So this is all bringing up back that memory, and it's sort of undermining what I saw over there. This sort of stellar Canadian military is there, and you're saying no, we protect Canada pretty much. Um, Before I go to the next segment, I should really ask this question because it's on everyone's mind, and that's economy. Um, to start talking about our economic relationship with Canada, that would be just ludicrous. That would take hours on, as you and I talked. We share the longest border, so inevitably there's a lot of commerce. Canada is our second largest trading partner. So instead of any individual point that I could ask you, is there something that we Americans should know about this intertwined relationship, our economies, our joint economies? What's the takeaway for Americans on that point?
I think the takeaway is that, first of all, there is huge interdependence. The Premier of Alberta, by the way, one of Canada's most important provinces economically, it's where all the oil and natural gas
Yeah.
are, pretty much. Well, certainly the most important supplies. The Premier of Alberta went down to Mar-a-Lago,
Huh.
which is flying under the radar probably for a lot of American news, but it got a lot of attention in Canada. And here's why her visit is such a good way to answer your question. She was very careful, at least what was publicly quoted about what she said to Trump. The effects of a tariff, even something significantly less than 25% on Canada, would be catastrophic. And also,
For
it would
Canada, for
hurt.
Alberta?
Well, for she was very concerned because of all the cross-border exchange. You can find these probably on YouTube as well, Adele. The Premier of Ontario, Ford, has been purchasing commercial time on American TV stations, and it's unintentionally funny if you know the subtext. The commercials talk about how Ontario really loves, his province really loves the United States, and he doesn't mention the name Trudeau in the commercial. It's almost like saying, please do not associate us with the anti-American nationalism of our soon-to-be
Oh,
departed
wow.
premier. If it had a banner at the bottom, that would be the longish title. And she did the same thing. The premier went down and said, translating her more diplomatic language into plainer speaking, is in soon to be President Trump, please don't put this tariff on. I would sum it up in the following way: if you hit somebody really hard and punch them in the face, that would hurt them, but your hand would still hurt too. That's the
Yeah.
point. It would still
Wow.
hurt. You might even break a knuckle or twist a finger. It's an asymmetrical interdependency. That's technical political science language. What it means, and it's talked about a lot, is while Canada depends on the United States more than vice versa, the United States still suffers deadweight losses if it imposes tariffs. Some have even compared tariffs, if they happen, to a tax on Americans, as in, hey, you're going to have to buy more expensive stuff now
Yeah.
because the Canadian items have been priced through the roof. And the reason I mention it is I see Trump, and I can't remember who I'm borrowing from. There was an article about this recently. Trump is a game theorist. This is a branch of economics where you use math to study strategy and tactics. So why do I mention it? If you threaten tariffs against someone, let's say Canada, and the two most important provinces arguably are Ontario and Alberta, who we're talking about, it's not surprising that you're getting some reactions as in, please, Mr. President, don't tariff us. And then Trump smiles and nods privately and says, now they're doing what I want. They'll now bargain with me. So the author of The Art of the Deal
Yeah.
doesn't really want to impose tariffs. What he wants are, from his standpoint, representing U.S. interests, sensible middle ground concessions by the Canadians to get what he wants. And then if he doesn't ever have to put on the tariff, guess how much he hurts his own country? Zero. That's what's going on here, I think.
The art of the deal.
He's applying that. Somebody else, again, I want to credit whoever it was, came up with the idea. Some of what Trump does looks like what we academics call game theory, like where these mathematical models of essentially how to get what you want in the best possible way. For anyone who wants to see this in a movie, A Beautiful Mind, the story of Nash, the Nobel
Yeah.
Prize winner, that can be your intro to game theory without having to look at a textbook. And so it's really about how to best represent your interests and to do so in a rigorous and optimal way, to use another word from academe. I think Trump is doing that right in front of our eyes with this whole tariff threat thing
Yeah.
against Mexico too. We could have added that.
Um, I mentioned to you that I had visited the Calgary Stampede, and later you talked about Canada's premier and how interconnected her province is to America. One thing that my family and I found very interesting at the airport is how many Americans from Southern California, Texas, New Mexico, Florida would fly to Calgary and drive to Montana. I was like, what? It's like, it's just cheaper, it's more convenient. So talk about being interconnected. Let's take a break here. We'll return shortly to talk about Trump, Trudeau, and Canada and the history behind all of that. We'll be right back. Dr. James, is there any history behind Mr. Trump's posturing and potential plans for Canada? We mentioned some of that at the top of our conversation. I'd love to learn more.
Yes, the idea of annexing Canada comes up episodically from essentially from the founding of the United States in 1776 onward. And I'd mentioned a few things earlier on the sort of eccentric Fenian interventions. There is really serious concern in the era of Andrew Johnson, who comes in after the Lincoln assassination, and in the Grant administration. We're in the sort of
So
late
we're talking
18th
1867 to 18 like 76.
and a little before,
Mm-hmm.
because the concerns are very high, because there's also in the United States a certain association of what becomes Canada, the British provinces, whatever they would be called back in the day, is, and they've been against us. Canada, for example, was used as a base of operation in the War of Independence in the 1870s.
Yeah.
Loyalists, in fact, a group named the United Empire Loyalists, this is what they became known as, people who exited after the colonies got their independence in the War of Independence. Some who were very ardent British loyalists, if they didn't go back to England, actually went to Canada. They're called the UEL. Canadians would know
UEL.
what that acronym means. So even back to the founding in the 18th century for the United States, there's a suspicion that Canada is, if you will, a territory that's a springboard for anti-Americanism. Sure enough, as we talked about earlier, there was the War of 1812. In the 1860s, during certain incidents in the Civil War, there could very easily have been the British coming in on the side of the Confederacy. What restrained it, of course, was the institution of slavery. Only a provocation from the Union, and it very nearly happened because of the blockade, could have brought about a war, but it absolutely could have happened. There could have been an Anglo-American war in the 1860s. And we talked earlier about the evolution of these things. One thing that didn't come out about the 1903 resolution of the Alaska border is this is the concession by the British when they side with the United States against their own Canadian compatriots. This is a signal: we need you. Germany is rising. Prussia has combined, of course, into modern Germany. Germany is very powerful. And privately, the British thought, we are going to be fighting another war at some point. We're going to need help. We need to reconcile with the Americans, make peace with them. And here's the key point: they're just more powerful than we are. By
Yeah.
1903, this understood among, again, we're back to the chattering classes, as in who's the big dog now in 1903? It is absolutely the United States. This is the era of Teddy Roosevelt,
Yeah. Yeah.
who is coming in. There's a sense of America entering the world stage. Remember what Teddy said? He's known for several aphorisms. This is one of them: walk softly, but carry a big stick. By 1903, the American industrial capacity is mind boggling. It has clearly surpassed even the most powerful European states. So, as we evolve forward in terms of circling back to your question, there have been from time to time tensions between Canada, pre Confederation and after, and the US. The US never quite gets around to a serious invasion of Canada. 1812 is kind of a nothing stalemate.
Yeah.
Again, not to trivialize the people who died long ago in that war. But after 1903, there is a cementing of the relationship. In the 1930s, there is something called the Ogdensburg Agreement, which is long forgotten now. In essence, the British are passing the baton openly because they still, it's a bit murky and hard to explain, but they still essentially dictate or largely dictate Canadian foreign policy. And what Ogdensburg means is that Britain understands that Canada and the United States have to cooperate to protect the Western Hemisphere. Britain just isn't up to protecting everything. At that time, it's still an empire. It's at terrible risk. There's already been a war with the Germans, and sure enough, they're on the rise again. And the
Yeah.
Ogdensburg Agreement symbolizes the understanding that the United States will protect Canada, as Trump put it many, many years later, but not take it over.
Hmm.
That's the grand bargain. Is in Canada's not a threat anymore. It's not a springboard for some silly British invasion of the
Yeah.
U.S. But
Yeah.
wow, what if an American enemy got control of it? What if the Russians or the Germans or somebody else
Or
ever
the
did?
Chinese.
Or the Chinese in many, many decades onward to contemporary 21st century politics. As you put it earlier, Chinese are not exactly a geographically Arctic state, but don't tell them that.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's interesting when you were talking about the 1903 agreement in which the British betrayed, that's my word, not yours, but sort of betrayed their Canadian compatriots. 3 or 4 years before that was the Spanish Civil War. I'm sorry, the U.S. Spanish War, in which we took Cuba, I think Puerto Rico,
Philippines becomes
Philippines.
a
Yeah, so
protectorate.
that
Yeah,
that the timing of that was no accident at all with the rise of the German Empire. So, in the last segment, you mentioned the premier of Ontario. Did I say that right? Premier of Ontario, is that correct? Okay.
correct.
The Ontario province buying commercial airtime in US TV channels, and saying, look, don't connect us, associate us too closely with Justin Trudeau. So, does Justin Trudeau's resignation change the relationship between Canada and America?
It does. And here I'm getting into a very murky crystal ball, but I'll do my best.
Okay.
In the short term, Paul, unless there's an absolutely bizarre outcome to the election, I got into this a little bit in an op-ed I did with the Conversation.
Hmm.
And in the Conversation, I talked a little bit about this for those who would want more details. Briefly, as Trudeau exits, a certain strain of virulent anti-Americanism is, at least its standard bearer, is leaving in absolute disgrace. I haven't looked at a poll in the last few days for Trudeau, but even most members of his own party wanted him out. Public opinion is virulently again disposed against him. Paul Levy, the conservative leader, is very likely to be the next prime minister, and even as well likely to have in a parliamentary system what's known as a majority. It's different than the U.S. because there's no separation between the legislature and the executive. So Paul Levy will preside over essentially the equivalent of the U.S. Congress with probably a very strong majority, which is hard to do for conservative party politicians. Okay, that's going to happen
Wow.
soon. What does that
Wow.
mean? it, Pahlavi in his rise to power marketed himself as a sort of kind of, I'm oversimplifying here, Canada's answer to Ronald Reagan, uh, with a hard edge against political enemies. He has softened his image lately because he knows a general election is coming. He and Trump have strands of populism that are remarkably similar. But imagine somebody on a high wire act balancing. On the one hand, Canadians are eager not to be trampled by Americans and want to preserve their sovereignty. So having Pahlavi representing them is less likely to anger and provoke a Donald Trump type of leader in the
Hmm.
US.
Hmm.
So that's a good thing. But Pahlavi has to be careful. If he goes too far and appears to be a stooge, sounding like an echo of Donald Trump, that will lead to the resurrection of, call it the Trudeau style nationalist anti-American left in Canada. Pahlavi strikes me as a
Oh,
very skilled politician.
I see. So
Um,
if Paula V comes in and uh, I'm searching for words here, but sort of appears to be sort of the lapdog of Donald Trump, Canadians will recoil at that. The sense of
so
nationalism will bubble up.
here's some free advice from him if he happens to be watching. Don't go to Mar-a-Lago. Meet with Donald Trump as soon as possible at a neutral location. The White House is fine.
Yeah.
That's understood. Canada is the less powerful state. It makes sense for the visit, arguably the initial one, to be in the US. But Mar-a-Lago has a symbolism since all the tech billionaires who previously trashed Trump and even tried to defeat him have been going there. I mean, even some MSNBC hosts have been going there, and effectively, this is just my opinion, not no evidence. It's like they're groveling, saying, "Please don't hurt me," and it looks terrible.
Yeah.
In order to maintain at least a quasi peer status, I think if Trump is smart, and he is a very cagey player much of the time when he doesn't lose his temper, he's going to make every move to say, wow, this Pahlavi, he really has things figured out. I would like to partner with him. He is, in other words, every signal that Donald Trump can give, as in, thank goodness the Canadians have given me somebody I can regard as an equal partner. That's exactly what Pahlavi will want Donald Trump doing in terms of an image. Is in, here's a really intelligent, solid managerial guy, why just like me. And I think in the short term, relations will get better. In particular, if Pahlavi can protect border openness for commerce by saying, hey, Americans, no more of what Trump has been accusing us of. We're going to be very responsible about our border. We're not going to be fighting you about this like the Mexicans. Let's really do everything we can to strengthen the border security while keeping the commerce open. That's music to everyone's ears. I think Pahlavi, if he can pull that one off, shoots up in popularity. Over the long term, okay, what if, and this will happen, what if there's another very left of center Canadian prime minister, maybe even one from the NDP? That's too foggy and far away. I'm not even going to try that one. But at least for the near term, I think relations will get better. And Pahlavi will go as far as he can get away with it without falling off that wire and looking like an American stooge.
Well, that's good advice for Canada's high politicians. Um, what do Canadians think of Trump now? I, I'm not talking about politicians. We already talked about that. Just your average Joe, your average Jane Canadian.
I overheard somebody when I was sitting in a restaurant. This is a great way of summing it up, and then I'll elaborate a bit. Said, I won't use the salty language, of course. You know, I hate that blank, but my wallet loves him. So what is that? Okay, that's just saying
I
they
hate
realistic
Trump, but my wallet loves him. And this is a
loves him.
Canadian saying that.
I'm a Canadian myself,
Yeah.
and have spent so much time around Canadians. I'm always back visiting friends
Yeah.
and family when I can. Canadians, if your audience is interested in this, read a book, a couple of them. Read Star Spangled Canadians. This is about Canadian expatriates in the U.S. Canadian people are generally uncomfortable with blowhards. They don't like bragging. They don't like bullying. They don't like narcissism. Does that sound like anybody we know? Now, to be fair, Donald Trump was a reality TV star
Yeah,
born with a
yeah,
silver spoon in his mouth. He is an absolute, love him or hate him, he is a genius at self promotion. He's our P.T. Barnum in the
yeah, yeah,
21st
yeah,
century.
exactly.
He's almost invented, as in, if I were going to make up a celebrity who Canadians would find annoying, I couldn't do any better than this. Then there's also the perfectly coiffed hair, the orange tan. There's a whole bunch of things. Your average Canadian looking at their TV screen is pointing and saying, that guy's in love with himself. I can't stand him. At the same time, after the miserable economic performance of the Biden administration, also, and here I'm injecting my own opinion. I don't have good analytical proof for everything I'm about to say, but I cannot imagine an American administration that could do more to encourage Russian and Chinese aggression than the one we've just had the last 4 years. So, where am I going with this? Trump's
Oh,
going to put money in my wallet. He is a loudmouth, but I actually think the Russians and the Chinese will be a little more skittish. And we don't want the Russians in the Arctic. And I think every reasonable person should be absolutely terrified of a Chinese incursion into Taiwan. That is a possible World War III. Iran getting a nuclear weapon. There's all kinds of
yeah,
things out there.
yeah,
So now the inner Canadian is saying, I'm gritting my teeth. I wish he wasn't such a blank, but probably things are going to get better now that he's back in power. No one will admit that publicly unless they are a very politically conservative person. And actually, Paula V would be very wise not to sound like that either. As I was saying a few minutes ago, my gut is telling me that Canadians are going to be better off with a Trump who learned a few things from the chaos he brought last time. He did not know how to run a public administration. He didn't know how to run a government. Let's see if he does better. But for the sake of argument, just not doing certain things that the Biden administration did. I'll just cite one. Canadians do not want gigantic inflation. And some of
yeah,
that from the big spending packages in the US, the pandemic created the excuse for doing this stuff.
yeah.
Back when the Dems were in control of everything, you could push through $1 trillion spending programs at the snap of your fingers. As that recedes, the Trump administration is committed actually to lower spending. And it's very hard to control the spending, but one thing you could do is control the rate of increase. So
Yeah.
my prediction is there will be lower inflation in Canada. They won't give Trump any credit, but Paula V can smile and say, maybe I'll get the credit if that all happens. I think it does.
Um, wow. I'll end our conversation with this question. It's a bit of a hypothetical, and it has more to do with the U.S. than it has to do with Canada. You know, Canada as our 51st state, would that really benefit America? It's one thing to have a territory as a state versus have some sort of relationship with it, have some forts, military bases here and there. I mean, humongous territory that Canada is. Plus, here's almost 40 million people that you have to manage who've never been part of your nation. So, would such a proposition, Canada 51, help benefit America?
Absolutely and utterly not. The current arrangement with a somewhat more smoothed out commercial exchange. In other words, better border management. Fire and brimstone from Trump about the border being a mess and how he's going to put on tariffs. Let's say all that gets negotiated away in a sensible manner. Canada makes no sense as part of the United States because here's where the Canadians are right. Remember, I said they exaggerate the differences?
Mm-hmm.
The differences are real. They're significant. I'm sure staffers on the Trump team have already said, Mr. President, if you actually got your own way, congratulations, you just added two more liberal Democratic senators. Canada, even its conservative party, capital C, is not the Republican Party of the United States. It's not even the John McCain wing, the George Bush 41 wing, which is more centrist.
Yeah.
Canadians, the conservative Canadians who love Trump are very small in number. They would be dwarfed by a huge vote. It would be just I would stand on my head if a Republican was ever elected, if Canada was voting as a whole. If in fact Alberta, for example, was a state, yes, of course,
Yeah.
Republicans would be very competitive there. But realistically, the cultural differences and the way in which the countries have diverged since they were all, with rare exception of Quebec, pretty much all British colonies. That's their point of origin. And some Spanish and a little bit French. The countries make no sense as a country because the Canadians are right. Hey, we're too different to be one
Yeah.
country.
Yeah.
So the Americans are wrong and saying it's just like we are with more snow. No, it is not. And the key cultural difference is one we've talked about, and I would reinforce here, and that is a greater comfort level in Canada with collectivism, as we academics call it. That is, I trust my government more on average if I'm a Canadian. I'm more comfortable with it controlling things like healthcare. In addition, there is nothing like manifest destiny that exists. There's nothing like the Monroe Doctrine. Canadians, even those who are more favorable to funding the Canadian forces and bringing them up to respectable levels of support, they still don't like war. Back to Canadian foreign policy, very few will know this in all likelihood, but the Canadian identity and bragging when it becomes military is never about Canadian military victories in World War I and World War II. Instead, it is about peacekeeping. Canadians will tell you,
Oh.
listen, hey, you have a military in this country. What are you proud of? What did it ever do anyway? They won't talk about Vimy Ridge in all likelihood unless they're very old. They won't talk about World War I or World War II. They say, we Canadians have had peacekeeping in our tradition, and we've had important roles in bringing about peace. Why our prime minister, when he was foreign minister, Lester Pearson, everybody called him Mike. Mike Pearson was the Nobel Peace Prize winner in 1957 for negotiating an end to the Suez-Sinai War of 1956.
Wow.
Importantly, and here's another theme coming back, Adele, Eisenhower respected and listened to Pearson. And that was because in 1956-57, Canada still was a significant military spender. Canada had a very solid military at that time. And later presidents, secretaries of state, have been on record, especially after they're out of office and can speak freely, with just having contempt for the Canadians and saying, they're just so different than we are. They just won't support self-defense and security. What are we going to do with them? Condi Rice, for instance, after she was retired in her autobiography, said, you know what? Meeting with Canadian officials, it's a lot like when I'm at my condo meeting. I don't really expect anything interesting or important to happen. That's pretty pretty negative and pretty nasty. So to circle back, that was a bit of a long-winded excursion on my part. Apologies, but
No, that's
Canada,
okay.
for a whole bunch of these unsystematically stated reasons, makes no sense as part of the United States. But importantly, can it come back into status, which I think it's been elbowed aside by Britain and arguably Israel? Can Canada come back into prominence as the hero's best friend in the movie, right? Can Canada be the friend of the American hero as it takes its leadership, self-designated role to protect the free world, whatever that means these days? I think it can. And I think that election that's coming up, Adele, is going to move things in that direction. But so much is hard to see for the future.
Yeah. Dr. James, thank you so much for educating me and our audience. And to our audience, if you know of any history that could provide more perspective from the past on this subject, please share it with us and tell us what's your perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.